Welcome, everybody. Today, we're going to be talking about Unit 3, day number 4, and we're talking about the Declaration of Independence and the build-up, kind of where we left off last time with Lexington and Concord, and then the build-up to the Declaration of Independence. So, like I said, last time we left off with Lexington and Concord. At this point, Massachusetts had been declared to be in open rebellion to the British. So in response to that, you're going to see that General Thomas Gage, he dispatches 700 soldiers to capture colonial leaders and supplies that were at Concord, Massachusetts. Basically, what you had there was a large storage of gunpowder and weapons that the colonists had been stockpiling for a long time in case there was a struggle against them. So when those troops were sent out, you're going to see Paul Revere famously would warn the Patriots, who would then meet the British first at Lexington and then at Concord. The British had gone there not really expecting a military confrontation between them and the colonists. So the colonists were actually able to be very, very successful in this. What you're going to see for the early part of the war, colonists were not super successful in the fighting that they did against the British. But now it is very apparent that compromise would no longer be an option between the British and the colonies, even though there are going to be attempts to do that. Compromise is no longer an option. And you can check out that video there showing the aftermath from John Adams' point of view. So Ralph Waldo Emerson in 1836, they would dedicate the monument to the Minutemen there at Lexington and Concord. And at that dedication, he would write this very famous poem called the Concord Hymn. And in that, you have the key line there in bold, which is one that's really stuck in people's minds. He said, and fired the shot heard round the world. And that's what the Battle of Lexington and Concord, that first shot, is called, the shot heard round the world, just to show the momentous impact that in the beginning of the Revolutionary War would mean for even the rest of history through now. So you can see where Lexington and Concord is on that map right outside of Boston. So the Lexington and Concord happened there. And as I mentioned last class, I talked about how here in Virginia that the royal governor had gone to Williamsburg and had taken some of the gunpowder out there and put them on British ships in the Chesapeake Bay. Well, here in Virginia, Patrick Henry they took armed troops to right outside of Williamsburg, but they were actually able to negotiate with the governor, where the governor paid Virginia, and that money was going to go into the Virginia legislature for the gunpowder. Now, if word had actually reached Virginia about the Battle of Lexington and Concord, I think that probably would have turned out very differently and would have turned into something similar to Lexington and Concord. But to that point, you still did not have fighting here in Virginia. So Second Continental Congress would meet in May of 1775, and shortly after the meeting, you'd have 3,000 British troops that would attack Bunker Hill overlooking Boston. Famously, there would be 3 assaults, and you always hear the words, "Don't fire until you see the whites of their eyes." That was said there, and even after 3 assaults, the British were finally able to defeat the Americans there. In response to that, George Washington, who had the support of John Adams, would come to lead the army. But still at this point, a majority in Congress are hoping for some sort of reconciliation with Great Britain. Sam Adams, Patrick Henry, of course, they are still at the leading front of we need independence and we need it now. So in the Second Continental Congress, again, to appease these people who thought that we could hopefully get some sort of independence, you'd have John Dickinson, who would write the Olive Branch Petition, basically saying, hey, we are loyal to you, King George, and we want to make things better with you. King George, obviously, there's going to be a delay in him seeing this petition, but when he did receive this petition, he refused to read it and instead declared the colonists as traitors. Now, July 5th, the colonists do that. July 6th, they were preparing for war, even if they were trying to make peace at the same time. They would pass the Declaration of Causes and Necessity of Taking Up Arms. And with that, that would be written by Thomas Jefferson and John Dickinson. And basically, it called on the colonies to prepare for war by providing troops and explained the reasons why the colonies would be taking up arms against the British if other things did not work out. George III, when he finally does receive this, he does respond, and you can check out the video there of the response, but he responds with, by the king, a proclamation for suppressing rebellion and sedition. And in that, he said that their officers were obliged to exert their utmost endeavors to suppress any rebellion and to bring the traitors to justice. So you're going to see a pretty harsh response from him there. And again, making it very, very clear that war would be on the horizon. So at the beginning of the war, you're going to see Patriots do win support for an invasion of Canada to hopefully add a 14th colony, and they are able to defeat the British at Montreal, but they would fail to take Quebec City, and there wouldn't really be any serious fighting in Canada after this. The colonies do end all exports to Britain and any of the sugar islands, basically any areas controlled by Great Britain. The Britons would respond with their own act that outlawed trade to the colonies. And also you start to see in the South that you'd have skirmishes break out between patriots and loyalists in the South as well. Now, as I said, and we've talked about before, that early in the 1760s, you're going to see most people still very much supported the king and were in support of him. And you can even see up to this point that we are talking about that a lot of people still favored trying to reconcile with the king. But you're going to see at this point still in 1775, a lot of people had changed their mind on supporting the king. They accused the king of supporting repressive legislation, obviously the tax legislation, and ordering armed retaliation. And you're going to see even that Quaker-led Philadelphia would turn against the king due to the fear of what could happen as far as business would go there. And famously, you see there in the painting that a statue of King George III would be torn down in New York, and that statue would be melted into bullets for the Continental Army. Interestingly enough, George Washington was not very happy that people did that and basically said that it was unbecoming of a person to do something like that. But he did thank them for their resourcefulness in taking it down. The Scots-Irish, you're going to see the Scots-Irish would also become patriots as well. They pushed for equality, and a lot of them saw it as similar to their struggle that they had against Great Britain back in Europe. They also had, a lot of them had the saying, no king but King Jesus, and liked the idea of getting rid of a king. And then the next step in this is that in January 1776, Thomas Paine would write the pamphlet called Common Sense. And Common Sense is really going to be the thing that puts together a lot of the arguments for independence and for declaring independence, puts it together in one pamphlet, and it was done in an easy to read way. You can still read Common Sense today and find that it's pretty easy to read. And it was something that, again, that a lot of colonists would read and finally understand why independence would be so important. So in it, he called for independence and a Republican form of government. He would list a lot of reasons why the colonies should declare independence. He would even go into talking about biblical arguments by looking at, he would compare the king to the Old Testament of the Bible when the Israelite people ask God for a king, and he basically says, I'm going to punish you by giving you a king, and that kind of thing. So he draws on that. He also uses other arguments, talking about how basically ridiculous it is that such a small island would rule a great continent, and that kind of thing. So you're going to see Common Sense, again, goes through a ton of arguments. I encourage you to read that sometime. But this would spread throughout the colonies. A lot of people would read it, and talk of independence would greatly increase during this time as a result of Common Sense. On the back of that, again, that's January of 1776. In June of 1776, you're going to see Richard Henry Lee, who had been a leading pusher for independence from Virginia. He presents the Virginia Convention's Declaration of Independence. And the Declaration of Independence had been written by Thomas Jefferson with the help of John Adams and Ben Franklin. John Adams had been approached to write that, and he chose Thomas Jefferson to write that based on Thomas Jefferson's writing ability and the fact that John Adams wasn't liked by a lot of people. And Thomas Jefferson was a Virginian, which would help in their cause. So you're going to see that this is going to have a harsh reaction in Congress, that some of your most staunch loyalists and moderates withdrew because they knew that they were going to be defeated and that they should probably get out of town while they could. July 4th, 1776, the Declaration of Independence would be approved by Congress. And in the Declaration, again, I love reading the Declaration of Independence. They actually list out all the grievances against the king and say some very pointed things against the king. In it, Jefferson establishes the idea of popular sovereignty. Well, actually, it's an idea that already been around, but he puts that in there. And a republican government with the defining values of a new nation. Another interesting thing about the Declaration of Independence is that in Thomas Jefferson's original draft of that, he wrote a very, very stinging rebuke of slavery in there. And that was one of those things that Ben Franklin and John Adams encouraged him to take out of the document because they told him that if you had that kind of thing in there against slavery, that the South would not be on board with the Declaration of Independence, which Jefferson knew in writing that would probably be the case. But again, he wrote the stinging rebuke of it. And this is one of the great, I could say, ironies of all of this is that you're going to see a lot in what the founding fathers write in our battle for independence. They mention several times the king putting them in a condition of slavery and that kind of stuff. And people look at that and say, man, how hypocritical of them to use slavery and compare what they were going through to Britain with slavery with like actual slavery. And it is very hypocritical. You're going to see some of the leaders like Patrick Henry, Thomas Jefferson, and others had actually pushed to loosen restrictions on slavery, like get rid of, allow slave owners to free their slaves and that kind of things. And those were always met with very harsh responses, especially by slave owners. So despite their attempts, that wouldn't happen. But you do see that with this Declaration of Independence, that you are going to have some attempts to try to do something about slavery, just as all the attempts basically do until the Civil War, they would not work. But Declaration of Independence, again, I encourage you to read that and to jump into it. I have several lines in the Declaration of Independence. It's one of my that are my favorite. I really like in it, though. It says, in every stage of these oppressions, we have petitioned for redress in the most humble terms. Our repeated petitions have been answered only by repeated injury. A prince whose character is thus marked by every act which may define a tyrant is unfit to be the ruler of a free people. And if you think about all that we have talked about, the colonies were repeatedly going to the king, issuing petitions and doing that kind of thing, and none of it ever worked. And eventually it came to this point where they felt like that the only way that they could get the king's attention is by bringing war against him. And finally it got to the point where they realized that they would just prefer to have independence versus being under the king anymore. So you're going to see there's a video here showing the ratification vote actually in the Continental Congress there. And you're going to see that in this video, when you watch it, that at the end of it, that the delegates are going to have a very specific reaction when they have approved the Declaration of Independence. And I want you to watch that video and see what their response is. And after you see what their response is, you might be wondering, why did they respond in that way? Well, I'm going to tell you why. I still want you to watch the video, but I'm going to tell you why. And the reason why is because within the British Empire, the punishment for treason was known as hanging, drawing, and quartering, and it was a very, very brutal punishment. So, first of all, what they would do, if you're convicted of treason, hanging. So they would hang you up until you had basically are almost completely suffocated, and then they would cut you down. Right before you die, they would cut you down. Then they would do the drawing process, which usually involved you'd get dragged to an executioner's table, where then you would be cut open and your entrails would be removed from your body and set on fire while you were alive. Again, pretty close. Then once you finally died, they would then divide your body into 4 parts, and the king could do with whatever, with your body, whatever he wanted to do. Another part of this would be called corruption of blood. And basically with that is that they prevented your family from generations from owning any property at all, which basically meant all of your family was going to be destitute for, basically forever is what you saw. And I think that's why it's so important when you hear at the end of the Declaration in it that they say, here we go. The last line that you're going to see here, and it says, "And for the support of this declaration, with a firm reliance on the protection of divine providence, we mutually pledge to each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor." Because if you look at that punishment right there that they were going to be enduring if they were caught and convicted of treason, they literally were putting their lives on the line, of course, their fortunes and their honor. And their fortunes, you could even say their family being included in that because of what was going to happen to their family after that. So with this, got the question, was the Declaration of Independence and the American Revolution a political, social, religious movement? This is something we talked about on the very first day of class. I encourage you to think through that as well as some other key questions there. You are going to read the Declaration of Independence today and answer some questions about that. So now we are fully in the American Revolution. We have the Declaration of Independence. Again, a lot of people tend to think the Declaration of Independence happened, then the Revolutionary War. But really, you could say the war started before the War for Independence started, with Lexington and Concord happening at the beginning of this. So enjoy reading the Declaration of Independence today. And again, I encourage you to read that. And if you can, even go back and try to find Jefferson's original notes on the Declaration of Independence, where he had a rebuke of slavery within the Declaration of Independence. So I hope the best for you all and have a great day.